time he and Jeremy are meeting in person, I think there'll be some sparks there probably, because they're both guitarists, jazz guitarists, and lead, done a lot of work in bands and recording and that kind of thing. So it feels kind of nice to have people showing up in person. It starts bringing back some of the issues that arose when you would have 50 people show up, for instance, which we had once in a while, especially on a Wednesday night, newcomers. And just difference between a sitting session online where we don't typically go through instructions, meet and greet, show people around, that kind of thing, obviously. So that was a little strange to back through that, where typically when you're operating with a open door, and you have newcomers coming, you have to meet and greet them, you have to adapt, you have to be ready to give at least brief instructions, even though most of the people present don't really need to hear the instructions again. It doesn't hurt, obviously. It doesn't hurt for old timers to have a refresher on posture, breath, attention, cane hand walking, meditation, et cetera, et cetera. So for me, it was a little deja vu flashback to what it's usually like around here. I think we'll be set up in a minute. Our techies over there struggling with getting Facebook online. I'm vamping till ready. Okay, so they're giving me this sign. I can't hear any of you. I don't know if I can hear any of you or not. Somebody say something. Randy? Okay, so let's just do a quick Q&A while they're still getting us looking for Facebook. They found it. But anybody online now have any question they'd like to raise that we can address here immediately? We'll be looking at the book once again, since the book is starting as the reading group in June. I think if I refer to this book again the next fourth Sunday, which is my day to do contemporary teaching, it will be in the context of the reading group being probably deeply immersed in the book by then. But I'm assuming at this point, I know some of the friendly, familiar faces that I'm seeing who have read the book that I know of for sure. Is there anybody who has a question about the book that you can just raise your hand? And let me see the showing of hands. Anybody who has not started reading the book? Anybody who is not on board tonight? Okay, a little bit, not at all. Okay. So, and not at all. Okay, I see Leota. And Brendan, have you started reading the book or not? Oh, a little bit. Okay. Choto. Skoshi. Okay, so it seems that nobody has any questions. So I thought what I would do tonight, for me, I mean today, my producer just gave me a funny look. I'm a 24/7 person, right? There is no such thing as night. There is no such thing as day. Very Zen thing. Anyway, I thought what I would do is once again read for those of you who are not familiar with the book, quickly just the chapter titles. And if anybody, if you have a notepad or something, you want to make a note to ask question or want to hear something from a chapter, please just write it down. I'm going to read today from the first introducing the original frontier. There is a foreword by Norm Fisher, which is a very nicely written foreword, introducing the original frontier, and then the closing bit on the original frontier. So I'm just going to go into a little bit of the meaning of the title, and they're not very long, so they won't take a lot of time, but there are some quotes, particularly in the first section that I will read. It's 2.5 pages or so. The last one is only about 1.5 pages, so it's briefer. And after the first reading, I will stop for questions and answers. So I recommend you make notes, especially on the quotes. So that's easy to remember. Quotes and notes rhyme. So if these quotes go by pretty fast, pretty quickly. But the quotes are also from people like Master Dogen, and so they tend to be very dense. So something might pop out when you hear one of the quotes in particular that doesn't make sense, or you haven't heard that, or you're not familiar with that. And so you might want to ask a question about the quote. So make a note about the quote. The things I'm saying in between, I talk a little bit about the quote, and I think this is written to be as accessible as possible. If you're not familiar with the cover, I'll show you the cover. I want to take the cover pages off paper, so it's a little easier to handle. And the binding, the printing, the binding, and everything is done very well. I think they did a very nice product. It was printed in India instead of China because of some COVID problem. So after introducing the original frontiers, designing a creative Zen life, most of you who know me know I come from a design background, design thinking, and working on a third book. The second manuscript is at the publishers now, called The Razor Blade of Zen. That one, whereas this is kind of a personal manual for individual practice that you can refer to and in between bouts of sitting, and it has some things on your excuses about sitting and so on. The second one, The Razor Blade of Zen, is much briefer. It's only about 108 pages. I didn't try to make it come out to 108 pages, but it just came out that way after all the editing process. And it's more about how Zen fits into American culture in the middle way, so to say, between the extremes of religion, fundamentalism, theism in general, and so forth, on one end of the spectrum, and way on the other end of the spectrum, rationalism, science. Materialist reductionism would be the extreme case there, and where Zen kind of runs right down the middle. So that the Razor Blade of Zen is more about a social take on Zen. This is more like a personal take. This is your personal world and how you can probably benefit from Zen. So it's introducing the original frontier, and we'll get into the meaning of that metaphor analogy. Designing a creative Zen life. And I think that Zen, in particular, Zen meditation, kind of the heart of creativity, which I can explain that if you like. It's explained in the book. Differentiating Zen meditation from all the others. We've gotten to the point now you can't throw a stone without hitting a meditation group someplace. So it's very important now, I think, that those of us who are propagating Zen try to clarify why Zen? Why Zen over all the others? Zen has a wonderful brand. I mean, it has a wonderful reputation, but it also has connotations of being very Eastern, being archaic, being old, being irrelevant, etc. So I think it's very important that we try to do our best to differentiate it from all the other forms of meditation that are on offer. And finding workarounds for your lousy excuses. That's a pretty long chapter. There are a lot of excuses, beginning with I don't have time, that kind of thing. Then deconstructing your senses in the most natural way. That's also a long chapter because it goes into quite a bit of detail on how we confront the senses in meditation. Embracing non-duality without losing your grip on reality. This is where we begin to move a little bit into the philosophy or implications of Buddhism's teachings. Then applying Zen to your life by applying your life to Zen is similar in that sense, but it's more practical. And then benefiting from Zen in every way imaginable, following the sages as guides through the frontier of Zen. So I wanted to touch on some of the what we call monsters of Zen and jazz. They have this term, the monsters of jazz. As some of you know, my dad was a jazz musician. He had a quintet in the 40s. My brother was a jazz pianist all of his life. And a monster is a guy like Charlie Parker, Thelonious Monk, somebody who's so good they're scary. So they're called the monsters of jazz. We have those in Zen. We have Dogen, we have Bodhidharma, we have Shakyamuni himself, and so forth. We call them sages, but I think of them as these guys who are so scary that are so good at geniuses of Zen that they're scary and monsters. So we have a monthly monster that we feature in Atlanta. Then concluding Zen as if that were possible, and then finally again a recap on the original frontier. So let that sink in a little bit while I read a bit from Welcome to the Original Frontier. And again, it doesn't go on too long. I know people hate to be read to. Although you look at the podcasts and the audiobooks today, I'm going to do an audiobook of this. Apparently people don't mind being read to in certain circumstances. And maybe it's just highly selective. So bear with me. Before I begin and while I sip my tea, does anybody have any questions so far? And I will ask Tsuki or Taylor, if you can, to sort of monitor the questions and call on the people. So you have to turn your camera on, raise your hand, or put the little hand icon up, or just turn your sound on and ask the question. And if not, we'll move on. So Taylor, can you do that from where you are?
Yes.
Okay, good. One more thing I don't have to worry about. Okay, Welcome to the Original Frontier is a subhead in introducing the original frontier. The ones that come before it are like the foreword, introducing the original frontier, age of anxiety redux, meaning, this is age of uncertainty at least, and then trying to put a little bit of the social context into place to say, why am I writing this book at this time or releasing it at this time? And then Welcome to the Original Frontier. The original frontier I speak of is not restricted to any one place, and it does not abide in a specific limited span of time. It is always here and now, ready, willing, and able to meet and greet us just where we are. It always has been, always will be. This is the point of no return that we approach in Zen, the frontier of consciousness itself. From the comfort zone of our familiar reality, we enter the strange territory discovered by Buddha, explored and settled by his descendants. After all, it has not gone anywhere. There is nowhere for it to go. Eihei Dogen, 1200 to 1253, founder of Soto Zen in Japan, indicates where we are to find the entrance in his early written instructions on Zazen. So here you might want to make a note if something is confusing. The way is completely present where you are. So of what use is practice or enlightenment? However, if there is the slightest difference in the beginning between you and the way, the result will be a greater separation than between heaven and earth. If the slightest dualistic thinking arises, you will lose your Buddha mind. The proper use of Zen practice then is precisely to overcome the seeming gap between you and the great way, exaggerated as it is by dualistic thinking. Another translation mentions the futility of pursuing enlightenment elsewhere, on pilgrimage, for instance. It has to be right here if it is anywhere. The frontier Buddha entered 2,500 years ago is still present today, still beckoning to all just over the hill, glimpsed from time to time, as it were, from the corner of your eye. But it is so close, so immediate and intimate that it is unperceivable. This is beautifully illustrated by analogy to the moon and snow in an ancient Zen teaching poem by Tozan Ryokai, 807 to 869, the founder of Soto Zen in China. The dharma of thusness is intimately transmitted by Buddhas and ancestors. Now you have it, preserve it well. A silver bowl filled with snow, a heron hidden in the moon. Taken as similar, they are not the same. Not distinguished, their places are known. The ostensible gap between our ordinary world and that of enlightenment is so subtle as to be virtually indistinguishable, like white on white. As long as we do not arbitrarily distinguish one from the other, they remain in their proper, quote, dharma locations or absolute positions in space-time. Then suddenly, a pivot from the perceptual to the experiential. The meaning does not reside in the words, but a pivotal moment brings it forth. The quote, pivotal moment is beyond words, but so slight a fine-tuning of awareness, it is easily overlooked. Continuing, so minute it enters where there is no gap. So vast it transcends dimension. A hair's breadth deviation and you are out of tune. Like the ocean to the fish or the sky to a bird, the original frontier is vast, yet seamless. The water and air are too close, too intimate to be an object of perception. But entering into this strange land radically changes perception itself. Any and all willing pioneers at any time and any place can enter this original frontier, no matter their circumstances. Like an old-fashioned radio dial, moving slightly to the left or right yields nothing but static. But what happens when we tune to the exact frequency? Continuing. With his archer's skill, Yi hit the mark at 100 paces. But when arrows meet head-on, how could it be a matter of skill? The wooden man starts to sing. The stone woman gets up dancing. Hitting the bullseye is what we all want in daily life. The skills developed over the requisite 10,000 hours of training, which may also be said of Zen. But what Zen calls upon us to achieve can actually happen. It is nearly impossible, like arrow points meeting in midair. When and if it happens, everything springs to life, including insentient beings, whether made of wood or stone. This is the central message and the spiritual legacy of Buddhism. It offers up the wish-fulfilling Mani jewel of Indian legend. This gem is said to be hidden on each person, all unknown to the bearer. But we tend to look for it everywhere else, as did Buddha, until he discovered it in meditation. This is a familiar syndrome, looking for love in all the wrong places, searching everywhere other than where what we are actually looking for is actually to be found. As my grandmother said, whatever you are looking for, you will find it in the last place you look. The flip side is that we hope to escape those circumstances we imagine to be the problem. This is the issue Buddha confronted in his 6-year quest, the universal problem, or koan, of suffering. He tried everything to dispel it, but nothing had worked. Then, the story goes, he sat down in resolute meditation and found the middle way, the path to the original frontier. He then laid out the map of the foreign territory for the rest of us to follow. So let that sink in a little bit. And refer to your notes if you have them. So the rest of the introduction here is what can this book do for you? How to read this book using the app, where I make the reference to computer application and literature. The reading in Zen is like that. If you're not using the application, not doing the meditation, doesn't help, doesn't make any sense. In closing with be aware of book knowledge, the irony of saying, don't read this book, writing as meditation, which is just a little comment on the process of sort of slogging through this. Any of you've done any serious writing know that in and of itself, it's its own koan. It's kind of a gut-wrenching process. So let's stop there for a moment, and I have a little bit more to read later, but let's see if we can begin the dialogue. The dialogue is the most important part. The questions you ask are more important than anything I have to say, but I'll do my best.
Randy's holding his hand up.
No, that's a question. That's a real question, and it goes to, I think really goes to kind of the heart of the matter. One of the major points that Zen is making, or Buddhism, is sometimes lost in the different sects and so forth. But we question not only our ideas or conceptions, right, about reality. We directly challenge and question our perception. Concept means grab or grasp, catch. Con means with. So concept means any given concept, I am grasping this idea. I'm grasping with this idea. I'm grasping that, the notion, the concept. I'm getting it. Percept means through. Per means through, catching through, so through the senses. So the idea here is that the sense data is flowing through all the senses, so it's constantly moving, and we catch it at a certain point. We all have this expression we use, a snapshot. This is a snapshot of reality, and I use that in the book about the second book about this is a snapshot of the culture. It's constantly changing and moving. So percept and concept are different that way. We don't typically challenge perception like as we challenge conception. In fact, if my concept differs from yours, we're going to have an argument, right? And that's part of the creative process in design. We battle things back and forth until we, try to get the best solution. So there's nothing wrong or out of order about this. It's just the way the mind works. The perception, that is how raw sense data is translated into meaning and even differentiated into something I'm seeing, not something I'm hearing, not something I'm feeling, and so forth, is examined, you might say, in Zen. It's not taken for granted. This is the line, all the senses interact and yet do not. Interacting, they're linked together, not interacting, each keeps its place. So there's everything's kind of like a Venn diagram. There is separateness, but there is overlap, and there is sameness, but there is difference, and so forth. These are some of the principles of duality. So when we think of perception as the middle skandha, form, feeling, or is that the middle skandha, form, sensation, perception, impulse, consciousness? I think it is the middle skandha, where you're making the transition from matter and energy, or form and sensation, to the mental side of perception, conception is mixed in there. And so if you have a traumatic experience, you may suffer from PTSD. So you may go into a situation where you're not really under any danger, but there is a mental formation of panic or response to certain stimuli that occur in this environment that are like the time you got mugged or like the time you got attacked or whatever happened. And you pick those up subliminally and they form a conception of what is going on. It's not what is really going on. But you can have a panic attack. You can react in such a way as if you're in danger, and severe cases, PTSD, you relive the experience of the trauma. So that's the most extreme example of the difference between conception and perception. But Zen breaks it down even further than that. The raw sense data coming into perception and we're being interpreted by the sixth sense of the citta, discriminating mind, being interpreted and sorted into eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, mind, and so forth. The raw sense data itself is already considered corrupted. And then the interpretation of it by our mind, because of the conditioning, etc., is doubly corrupted. And so the reconstruction that the mind creates for us of our reality is what is called the constructed self. This is the self that is challenged in Buddhism. So I make the point that while, as Master Dogen said, all of this, however, does not become an object of perception because it is unconstructedness in stillness. I mean, it's no longer constructed as this all breaks down and we begin to enter the new frontier, or we begin to recover the original mind. It's not all so neatly categorized and separated out and differentiated. Do not suppose that what you realize will become your knowledge or is grasped by your consciousness. Elsewhere, he says it does not appear within perception. If practice and realization were two things, they could be recognized separately. So this is a fundamental teaching that it's not an object of perception that occurs, but you could say this transformation process that we go through in Zazen changes your perception directly, as if from underneath or from behind, if that makes sense. It's as simple as you're sitting facing the wall. All of a sudden you start registering light, color, and movement in your vision, your field of vision. You don't usually see that because you're looking around with your eyes, they're tracking everything, and the after image is being replaced by the next image over and over. When you sit still facing a blank wall, then you're pushing that envelope. You're like building a charge on that capacitor. And so the spark has to snap at one point. It has to jump the gap. And all of a sudden you start seeing stuff that isn't there. But it is there. You're seeing on a microscopic level or a different scale or whatever. You're seeing what you're seeing with. You're seeing it, the actual motion of the electricity and chemistry and so forth built into the neurological system. So this is where Hakuin says there is no inner and outer. So you can interpret it a lot of ways. And you can examine the implications of it a lot of different ways. But just stating that this is not an object of perception, and yet your perception itself changes. That's the simplest way I know to answer that question. I mean, the last thing I said, not the whole thing.
Any follow-up questions regarding what was just spoken?
Saying for thinking, like cogito ergo sum, we don't believe our own press. We don't simply receive the thinking and think, well, we must be right because I thought so. Wait a minute, that's monkey business. Anyone else? Looks like Ungan is getting restless. Okay.
Are we going section by section? Yeah, I've got a couple questions, but I'm not sure. Are you,
Up to you. I'll answer any question, then I just have a little brief thing to read in the end, and we'll have another.
yeah, on page 30, you say when the body becomes still, the mind must follow. I really like that saying, but don't you think the converse might be truer? That when the mind gets so crazy, the body follows that opposite of what you want.
That's right. And you can also say that when the body finally settles down and becomes still, the mind goes nuts. Because by contrast, you're not giving it anything to work with. When you settle into stillness, the monkey mind, the thinking mind, is not ready for that. It's used to dealing with conflict and chaos, and that's what it does. That's its job. So if you're giving it constant input, very low grade, very low level, it can't work with that. And so all the other stuff starts to bubble up to the surface. Sensei spoke of it as like bubbles rising to the surface of the pond. All the stuff underneath starts bubbling up, and you start going through all this mind dump, basically. Thank you. So you could say that all 4 different ways. As the body gets still, the mind goes nuts. As the body gets still, the mind becomes still. As the body goes nuts, the mind gets still. The tetralema will work.
You left the 4th one out. If the mind goes nuts, the body goes nuts.
Right. So Brendan had something. Brendan O'Flaherty. By the way, Brendan, Lindsay is the one I contacted you, put you in connection with. She's the one that just came back from Australia. And her better part, or worser part, John, was with her, and he's from Australia. So you guys might have some things to talk about.
No, I'm looking forward to connecting.
So you had a comment or question?
I do. Sometimes I think my scientific training works against me in Zen because of I don't quite know how to handle paradox. And it seems the first quote in the section you read contains logical paradox within the space of, I think, 2 sentences. The way is completely present where you are. So what is the use of practice or enlightenment? However, if there is the slightest difference in the beginning between you and the way, the result will be a greater separation between heaven and earth. I don't think we'll necessarily have an answer to that question by the end of this, but especially, I think my question is, as a practitioner, what's the correct attitude or approach to seemingly contradictory statements like that?
Yeah, and I was saying something about that, and I'm going to ask Cosets, because he comes from science. He's a physicist by training, so he might have some more scientific framework to address that same question. But I would say that if the slightest dualistic thinking arises, you will lose your Buddha mind, is not meant to be once and forever and you go to hell. It's more like in that moment, that's not the Buddha mind. The slightest dualistic thinking arises. And dualistic thinking would have to be characterized as a specific kind of thinking. Buddha, or Dogen, was known for his emphasis on non-thinking. And so it's particularly ironic that he's now considered Japan's greatest thinker, because he was sort of teaching how to stop the monkey mind, how to not rely on thinking, rational thinking, 100% of the time. And the quotes from Einstein kind of back that up too. He talked about being very intuitive and a visceral gut kind of feeling in his thought experiments. So this is not exclusively Eastern idea, but the cogito ergo sum kind of put a damper on the, I guess, the Enlightenment in the West to think that the very thinking mind is you or me. That's who we are. And says, well, wait a minute, check it out, listen to that thinking mind for a while. And you certainly are not going to want to take responsibility for what it's coming up with. So, but on the other hand, on the highest levels of thought, Einsteinian and so forth, the ability to discriminate is the most powerful thing we have. In a way, it's the most powerful tool we have. The discriminating mind has the power to discriminate against discrimination. So, it's kind of a snake biting its tail thing, but it's saying there's an old formula, I think it was Vedic, it's not this, not that, not this, not that, until, rejecting everything you experience until you finally come to something you cannot dismiss. And that has to be it. It's like peeling the onion at bottom, emptiness. But you can't deny what's at bottom when you finally get there. So that not this, not that is the discriminating mind. We're using it as the wedge, as the tool to crack open the Dharma gate, you might say. But we can't think our way to enlightenment, on the other hand. It has its limitation, like a monkey or a kitten or a puppy dog. Intuition, deeper, broader intelligence has to come into play. And that's, the description of Einstein sitting there with his pen, dozing off and dropping the pen. He's going off in these hypnopompic states. These are not rational states. These are like intuition, like when you're falling asleep at night or waking up in the morning. That's where a lot of the creative work in science and literature and so forth has been done in the past. And we enter into those kinds of states when we're sitting in meditation. We don't like to refer to anything as a state because that implies static and it's all changing. But, putting words in quotes, we can use the language, not be used by it. Any response to that before I turn Cosette loose on you? Cosette, you and I have had some discussions around how science relates to Zen thinking. But let Brendan tell us what science he does. Brendan, what is your specialty again?
Yeah, I have a neuroscientific background. I did my PhD at Emory.
Yeah, neuroscience. Keep it simple, I say. Narrow it down.
Thank you.
Matsuoka Roshi would often say, there's no dichotomy in Zen. In other words, whatever the dichotomies we find are in our perception, in our conception. And I think the thing that attracted me to Zen was there was a method. You don't just listen to your teacher and try to let him figure things out for you. You sit in Zazen and you go right to the root of things in your own perception, conception, awareness, or reduce it to experience, and you get to the point where you have to put quotes around all those words. Because when you use language to try, like Buddha and Dogen, when they try to use language to try to speak to this issue and try to point at it, finger pointing at the moon thing, it's always paradoxical. The language is dualistic itself. And so you can't say this half at the same time you're saying this half. You have to learn to use the language to get the reader or listener to sort of see, okay, we're coming at it from this angle, now we're going to come at it from this angle. And both angles are equally valid. It's just that, and they're not opposites of each other, but they're complementarities, like form and emptiness, even black and white, dark and light, hot and cold, yin and yang. It's like, so seeing the duality, as non-duality, you run out of words. The language just can't get there from here. Just saying physics, Adrian popped up. It must have been on the noosphere, and her antennae must have been waving. What do you have to say, Adrian? I'm going to ask Brendan, can you refer to that quote again so that Carola knows where we are, and just read it? And you said it was paradoxical. And as a scientist, you have a difficulty with the two contradictory ideas simultaneously. If you could read that quickly for Carola, I think she might have a comment on it. She listens.
It's on page 12. The way is completely present where you are. So of what use is practice or enlightenment? However, if there is the slightest difference in the beginning between you and the way, the result will be a greater separation than between heaven and earth. If the slightest dualistic thinking arises, you will lose your Buddha mind.
Calling you out, Adrian. Adrian is also a physicist by training. She runs the Muon lab at Georgia State. Did you have a comment on that, Adrian? Don't have to. We can move on. Well, if you do, you have to come off mute. We're not hearing. So anything else before we go to the last read for this morning? Leota, you have anything? Nope. And Jeremy Holt? Don't want to leave anybody out.
Oh, no, I didn't have anything. I enjoyed listening, though. Thank you.
Okay, good. And Buddy?
No, sir. Just enjoying listening. Thank you.
Buddy, by the way, for those of you who don't know him, has a monthly or weekly Taoist group, and I join them once a month. Put a little plug in for you there, Buddy. Did you guys have anything?
Just hold this.
This is Blair.
Hello. I'm glad to say that the original Frontier is now moved up to the front of the to be read queue for me. I haven't opened it yet, but it's next in line since I just finished Ken Kesey's electric Kool-Aid acid test. So I think it's a good lead in. I think it might be a good one to follow that. And I'm immediately, something that you said about sense stimuli being corrupted at the moment that it happens made me think of this acid test. line where the merry pranksters had just found out that it takes approximately a 30th of a second for the information to actually be received and processed. And, they were all like, oh, wow, dig that, man. They didn't have too many profound things to say about it. But for me, thinking of it from a Zen perspective is that, everything, it's just the way that we challenge our ideas of past, present, and future.
Yeah.
If even the present is technically a memory.
Yes. So this gets a little corny from coming from a person who's hasn't done the math and not trained in physics or, the deeper levels of science, but it becomes pretty self-evident that there's a kind of personal relativity involved here where your axis 0 in your space-time grid runs from the crown of your skull down through your spine, your central nervous system and so forth. Mine is in mine, and so never the twain can meet. Matsuoka Roshi used to say, your enlightenment is yours and mine is mine. I can't get yours and you can't get mine. And Uchiyama Roshi made the point that your whole world is born and dies with you. Nobody else has your world. So you can take this as kind of a personal take on relativity. Because Blair is sitting 6 or 8 feet behind me, anything that happens is going to be registered by his consciousness before it is registered by mine. If the sound is coming from behind him, for instance, or if it's coming from the other side, it'll hit me first before it hits him. The difference is minuscule. It cannot be even measured, but it's real. And so, as he was saying in real time, I never see Blair. He never sees me. We only see, something that was true or real microseconds ago. It takes time for the light to hit your retina bouncing off of Blair. Nobody ever sees Blair. So, and that may be good. That may be a good thing. So, you don't want to split these hairs too fine, but that's really a little bit what Zen is about. It's what is the reality. And so an example I can tell you that's a little bit more extreme maybe, or more germane. We were doing a long retreat here on the Shurangama Sutra, and in the Shurangama Sutra, Buddha goes through each of the senses in great detail, pretty much like the section on deconstructing the senses does here. But he did it on a not like at all. Mine isn't like his, and vice versa. But going through them one at a time and discussing their nature, the nature of the senses. And he talked about the faculty of the sense as existing in the mind, even if the person was blind. They still have the faculty of seeing. They see the dark. Even if they're deaf, they hear the silence. Who knows what deaf people hear? They probably hear what we would call sound, but it's coming through the body, not through the eardrum and so forth. The plasticity of the brain has been demonstrated in blind people to show that other parts of the brain can learn to see. And they put pads on the tongue and a big thing on the back, and they send video images into those. And after a while, the blind person could learn to see well enough that they'd have a ball roll down a ramp and they could catch it. But their eyes are completely gone. And so Buddha made this point that the sense is not dependent upon the organ. My experience during that retreat, there was a strange experience I had. We were getting up early, 5 o'clock, and starting. I would live about 5-10 minutes from the Zen Center, depending on traffic. So I'm sleeping at home and coming over every morning. And each day, we're taking one of the senses, and we develop these really completely blackout blindfolds that we used. So we sat blind for certain periods of time. We plugged up the ears with ear plugs, so you couldn't hear any outside sound at all. That was the noisiest period of sitting, by the way, because all of the inner sounds were amplified then. It was, if you walked around the room, it was like ka-choom, 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 each footstep, So this is what we're talking about, we didn't call that Zazen. We said, these are experiments, you know. We did one where we put candy in the mouth to do taste, and you could pick as many candy pieces as you wanted, how many you thought would take to last the half-hour sit. But you couldn't chew it and you couldn't roll it around or anything. Nobody dissolved even one piece of candy in 25 minutes. It just sat there on the tongue, and the flavor changed. Terry Sutton told me they did this in San Francisco. They would make you put one potato chip on your tongue and just leave it there. After a while, you hated it. you didn't like how it really tasted after a while. So in this one case, I'm getting up in the morning and I'm in the hallway and the house is dark, and I'm getting a glass of water from one of those jar type things with a spigot. And so I can't see it, so I don't want to spill. So I put my finger over the top of the glass so I could feel when the water is coming up, and I know the glass is full or nearly full. So I'm not going to turn the spigot off. So when I did that, I flipped the spigot off, I realized I didn't feel the temperature of the water. I felt it hit my finger first. I felt the touch, and then I felt the temperature. And so I shared this with one of our members in Huntsville at that time, and he was a medical doctor. And he said, well, there's evidence of that. He said, in physiology, they think that the part of the nervous system that detects touch is much more ancient than that can detect temperature. So apparently our ancient ancestors, at some point, being able to detect temperature was not that important or useful. That developed later in our evolution. But he said, I'd never heard anybody have an experience of actually registering the separation. First touch, then temperature. So try it sometime. Put your finger in a cold glass of water or a hot cup of tea and see if you don't feel the surface tension, the touch first and then the temperature. Anyhow, I think because we're sitting in such intense focus that we catch up to the present moment, or you might say we slow down to the present moment, so time changes for us. And our sensitivity to things that happen are then on a different frequency. So I attributed that experience, which was a big surprise to me. I had no idea what it meant. Just really came from being on the retreat that month. But that's an example of how our immediate, and I see Brendan shaking his head, so he's coming from that end of things. Maybe that starts to make sense, you know, from a neurological perspective or neuroscientist perspective. But it was a big shock to me, big surprise. But that's why we say the senses themselves, we don't even trust what you might call the raw sense data. We're not sure that it's accurate. And certainly when the organ is damaged, it's not. You know, some people are colorblind. Who is seeing the true color? If you sit for long periods of time, and here we have a dark floor, dark cushions, but if you have a light floor, dark cushion, and a dark cushion happens to be in your field of vision, if you happen, and we're sitting with fixed gaze, you happen to look away, all of a sudden there's this big, bright, shining, radiant square that is the same shape as the zabuton, or the zafu is round or whatever. The after image, zoom, 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 there it is, you can see it. So you have to ask yourself the question, which is the true color? The color that I'm seeing through this after image and the floor is extremely bright? Or is it the color of the floor when my eyes are still fixed where they were, and I may be seeing a little radiant edge around the cushion, but I'm not seeing the big bright square? Which is the true color? And the truth is, you can't answer that question, because if the after image is operative, it's constantly operative. So the color that you're registering in whatever room, environment, space you're in, and even the colors on the monitor, they're going to register relatively clearly, but the after image is always modifying them constantly. And the other way you can look at the after image is you're seeing the diminution of time. You're seeing time move. The after image disintegrates slowly. We're told that that's the chemistry dissolving in the retina. That each photon hitting the retina causes some sort of not only electrical response in the cone or cylinder it hits, but there's a chemical response around it, effluent. It then spreads through the retina. So people start seeing all this light, color, and movement. That's what I mean by saying you're seeing what you're seeing with. You're seeing into the micro scale of things, you might say. It's not exactly a matter of distrusting or mistrusting sense data. It's just we're not getting the whole story. The rest of the story is that everything is impermanent, moving, ever changing. Buddha taught that the mind imposes a false stillness on reality. So we keep it still. And it's for survival reasons. That's why we don't trust it in Zen. I mean, we trust it, but we don't think it's 100% accurate. There's a great comic said, young guy said, "Did you ever go in the bathroom in the morning and look in the mirror and say, this can't be accurate?" Every day. Okay, we all good? Anybody else? Okay, well, let's go on to the last little bit. It's not too much. I appreciate your patience. So the closing section of the original frontier, remembering the old frontier, recognizing the new frontier, and then re-entering the original frontier, which is the part I want to read. So we just get a kind of a bookend on the original frontier. And somebody brought up the last line in this section and asked questions about it last time. I thought that was very perceptive of her. Re-entering the original frontier. One evening, the story goes, young Prince Siddhartha sat down under a tree after pursuing various paths and disciplines for 6 years or so. Resolved to solve the conundrum of the intense suffering or dukkha he had witnessed, or die trying, he sat for 49 straight days, the story goes, according to legend. He did not die, fortunately for us and for all of humanity. However, what had been known as Siddhartha Gautama did cease to exist. The self, with its long list of unique human traits, was no longer determinative. What arose from that long, dark night of meditation was awake Buddha. The young prince was liberated from all prior causes and conditions, released from all self-limiting attributes and entanglements. But the actual circumstances of his life had not magically changed. Buddha himself had changed. The word Buddha means awake. Most of you know that. And by the way, he was not all that young. He was like 30, mid-30s, and that was pretty old in those days. Buddha himself had changed. For cynics trained by our comic book culture, this begins to sound a bit melodramatic. Siddhartha ducks into the telephone booth of Zazen, realizes supreme perfect awakening, Anattara Samyak Sambodhi, and emerging stands revealed as Shakyamuni, sage of the Shakya clan. A little bit like Superman, Clark Kent. But all sarcasm aside, in putting his life on the line, Buddha opened the original frontier for the rest of us. He is a genuine frontiersman and a real superhero. Buddha saw into the true conditions of life. He saw into them, the built-in unsatisfactory limitations of existence, the true nature of suffering as relentless change in this physical universe. While most of us seek various ways to avoid, ignore, or transcend the discomforting attributes of impermanence, imperfection, and insubstantiality, Buddha's awakening brought them front and center. They stand as a sober and compassionate reassessment of his and our reality. Let me say them again. Impermanence, imperfection, insubstantiality. His last resort was to sit down in meditation, in desperation, and in all humility, admitting to himself that even with all his learning and intelligence, he simply did not know that which he most needed to know. He sat upright, balanced, and alert, directly confronting the same inconvenient truths and life-threatening unpleasantries that we confront in our own practice, and I should say in our own time. Meeting the dictates of life head-on in Zazen was, and still is, the natural and most effective response to the problem of suffering. The fundamental koan is still with us, alive and well today. Buddha and his followers actively embrace change, universal suffering, as the absolute way. We leave behind the received wisdom of our culture and discover a new world, one that is ancient yet ever present and waiting to be explored in the midst of everyday life. Buddha re-entered the real world, the same world that all human beings, indeed all sentient beings, inhabit, though most are unaware of it. He woke up completely, but only to what already was and still is. In this awakening, there is no tangible change in anything other than our own awareness. In other words, everything changes permanently and for the better. Siddhartha Gautama sat up in meditation all through that night until the break of dawn. Some 2,500 years ago, the story continues. Upon seeing the morning star, he awoke. He, alone and on his own, discovered the original frontier, thus coming to the end of his spiritual evolution. He had become Buddha, the fully awakened one. In other words, he had become none other than his own true self. He recovered the same Buddha nature as yours and mine. He was the first to do so that we know of at that time, but he did not break the mold. For him, it was the end of becoming, marking his last birth, as he declared in his first sermon to his fellow monks, and the beginning of true being. In the process of his awakening, Buddha directly realized the nature and meaning of existence itself and of his own place in it, and by extension, the place of all humanity, yours and mine. He was, as we are, finally and fully at home, in our true home, in the heart of the original frontier. The takeaway, do thou likewise, come home to Zen. So before I take questions, I just wanted to say, Dogen said something very clear around this, I think. In Bindola, he says, when you find your place at this, when you find your place at this, no, when you find your way at this time, practice occurs, actualizing the fundamental point. When you find your way at this moment, practice occurs, actualizing the fundamental point. So very much space-time, where you are at this moment, practice can occur. By practice, he means realization. some sort of transformative insight, some kind of verification of your practice. And that if you find your way at this moment, practice occurs. So it's at this place, at this time, is the only time and place where this can occur. So I'll turn it over to Taylor again, see if there's any hands being waved. Don't make us call you out.
Does anybody have any questions or comments, concerns?
Never ask a yes or no question. Okay, now what questions do you have? Leota, let's hear from you. Tell us a little bit about yourself. You're unfamiliar to me a bit.
I'm new to this Zen practice, so I'm just anxious to learn and listen to what it's about. And I did go to the introduction to Zen class, I think 3 weeks ago.
Good.
Or 3 weeks ago. So I'm like beginner in this. So I'm like listening to all what you're saying in your book, and I want to buy your book. I just want to know where I could get your book at.
You can, it's available on Amazon, and it's available through Barnes and Noble. You can also get the Kindle version is available now. And you can also go to Red Feather themselves and get it direct from the publisher, Red Feather.
Red Feather, okay.
Yeah, Red
Okay.
Feather, kind of a neat name.
Yeah.
And Jeremy, I don't have much history with you. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your interests.
Sure. I went to one of the Wednesday night classes maybe a month ago. I think it was the gentleman, Mr. Mayhew. Maybe he was
Bill Mayhew.
Indeed. Yeah, I enjoyed that. I got interested through listening to some podcasts. I think Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind I've been listening to that a lot on YouTube, and I checked out Unmind on YouTube, and I enjoyed that as well.
That's the podcast.
Yeah, your podcast. So I'm pretty new. I was mostly just listening.
Where do you live? What part of the country are you in?
I'm in Sandy Springs.
Okay, so you can come personally when we get back up and running.
Oh, definitely. That was kind of my thought. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we're hoping into June and July we'll have an announcement come out.
Oh, interesting. And I was curious about the Taoist thing you mentioned, if there was a link or a website to that as well.
Buddy, can you put that link in the chat and send it so Jeremy can pick up the link?
Yes, sir, I will. Thank you.
Thank you.
So let me call out a couple of others. Anrak, Pat, you've been quiet as a mouse, as usual.
As usual. I have kind of a stupid question, I think. So when you were talking about your...
I have a lot of stupid answers.
No. When you were talking about your experience perceiving the touch of the water before the temperature of the water, would you could call that an example of like beginner's mind? Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I think maybe, I was fresh woke. I'm wandering around in the dark hallway, and I'm coming off of several days of this meditation where we're doing all kinds of silly things to our senses. And so maybe I think I was in a hyper state of alertness or something where I'm half awake, half asleep, so I'm not paying much, I always notice if I drink decaf coffee, if I notice if I start pouring the coffee grounds right into the cup instead of I'm not yet awake. I think it was one of those. So I think I was alert or open. You might say I was open to that experience. But I think the same thing happens in Zazen, the process of sensory adaptation, which becomes really extreme. This is where I think Brendan might find a handle and maybe even do some experiments. Sensory adaptation, right away, one of the first things that happens is in form, you're sitting there on the cushion and you can feel the cushion, but after a while, your butt turns numb. And so there's a boundary of fuzziness there, and you can no longer find where you begin and the cushion ends, or where you end and the cushion begins. So that's what they mean by sensation. Now you're moving into the skandha, or aggregate of sensation. Everything is becoming blurry. All the boundaries are starting to blur because it's energy. It's not solid, quote unquote solid. So yeah, I think those are that. My simple way of thinking about the process is just one of natural process of profound sensory habituation. It sets in for any human being who sits still enough long enough. And I think there's some corollaries, like I would say to Brendan, you know, when we sleep at night, deep sleep is supposed to have this beneficial effect, for instance, of cleaning the plaque out of the brain. It goes into the blood pools in the brain and goes into the blood system, and is washed out of the system. I think that should be, or could be, something very easy to test to see if prolonged periods of meditation cause that same thing to happen, and could that be done by blood testing? So you could demonstrate, for instance, that a long period of zazen starts to have the same beneficial effect of sleep by clearing the plaque out of the brain. That's just my hypothesis. I don't know, but that would be something I think would be in your, possibly in your bailiwick. Yours may be much more on a different scale, micro scale than that. By the way, the bell in the background is the mindfulness bell that we picked up from Thich Nhat Hanh, just to keep us mindful of the time. So time check, where are we?
12:03.
We're at 12:03. So any wrap-up comments or questions? Let's do those. I'm going to call out, Buddy hasn't said anything.
Since I always enjoy hearing the scientific mind grapple with paradoxes. Because it doesn't equate. And I remember when I started looking at those, said, how can this work? I just started doing what was suggested and not thinking about it, and was amazed at the outcome. And it didn't make no sense to me that when I prayed for someone, or sent love or compassion, did something compassionate for someone that I did not like, that reason I did not like them started melting away. And I don't know why these things work, but they work. I just had to put on the shelf the idea of having to understand first. So that was a good reminder. I always enjoy that. Thank you. Thank you.
I think, you know, Buddha did not understand this. It's not in the realm of understanding. So Adrian, I called you out before, but you didn't respond. Are you there?
I'm here.
Got anything to say?
Oh, I have so many things to say, but there's not time to say them. So
take the top one.
Okay, the top one is what happens when you sit and look at the wall and things start twinkling. Okay, there are explanations for this. One, you're twitching a little bit. You're never completely still,
right,
because your body is always idling. So you're looking at microscopically different angles of the wall, which is not perfectly smooth. And the other thing is that we know from sensory deprivation experiments that the brain is always idling, and if there's no input, it starts inserting dummy data. So I don't see anything profound in what you see, what you're staring at the wall. It's certainly not electrons. Okay.
So you're not giving me anything to work with, so I'm going to start making stuff up.
Yeah. Okay. So that's what's going on. It's not anything terribly profound. I mean, you're seeing that your angle changes and your body is changing and your brain is changing, but we kind of already knew that.
But it's not normal perception either.
Yeah, it is.
Okay, it is, but people are not aware of it.
Right. It's just that there's not much going on, and so your brain's going to latch on to what little is there.
Right.
It's physiological monkey mind.
Yep. I can always count on you. Okay, anybody else, any closing burning questions or wit and wisdom? Okay, well, let's finish with the